What if your parents decided who you married without your input? What if your engagement was as binding as marriage and could happen when you were barely a teenager? What if the church decided if you could even break up? Number 15. Chaperones everywhere. Stepping back in time to the medieval period, the concept of a private, unsupervised date simply did not exist. Forget about sneaking off to a movie theater or finding a quiet corner in a coffee shop. In the medieval world, especially for young women, every interaction with a potential suitor, or indeed almost any man outside of immediate family, was under strict observation. This wasn't just a suggestion. It was an enforced social norm that protected reputation, ensured proper conduct, and upheld the intricate web of family honor. A young woman's virginity and good name were considered her most valuable assets, and any perceived blemish on either could ruin her prospects for a good marriage, and by extension the social standing of her entire family. Therefore, chaperonage was a constant, pervasive element of daily life for anyone of marriageable age, particularly women who were these ever-present guardians. Often it was the girl's mother, aunts, older sisters, or even trusted female servants who accompanied her on any outing or when receiving male visitors. For noble families, a lady-in-waiting or an older, experienced gentlewoman might serve this role. For commoners, neighbors, or older relatives would naturally be present in the often communal living spaces. There was little concept of individual privacy as we understand it today. Homes, particularly in the lower social strata, were often single-room dwellings or multi-generational households where activities were open to everyone. Even in grander castles and manor houses, the layout meant that private chambers were rare, and public spaces like the Great Hall were where most interactions took place. A young woman, even if she were to meet a young man, would do so in a setting where many eyes could witness their every move. This was not just about preventing physical intimacy. It was also about preventing any conversation that might be deemed inappropriate, any lingering glances, or any suggestion of a clandestine relationship. Consequences of failing to adhere to this rule were severe. A young woman caught in an unsupervised situation with a man, even if nothing untoward happened, could find her reputation irrevocably damaged. Such an incident could lead to rumors spreading like wildfire through the community, making it exceedingly difficult for her to find a respectable husband. Her family, too, would suffer social disgrace. Potential suitors from good families would withdraw, fearing that such an association might tarnish their own lineage. In an age where marriage was primarily an economic and social alliance, rather than a romantic union, a damaged reputation translated directly into diminished prospects for a suitable match, and thus diminished family fortunes and status. For instance, a document from 14th century Florence, often cited by historians like Professor Laura L. Rhodes of the University of Bologna, describes cases where a girl's marriage portion was significantly reduced, or her parents struggled to find any suitor after she was seen walking alone with a young man, even if the walk was entirely innocent in its intent. The appearance of impropriety was as damaging as actual impropriety. The very structure of medieval society reinforced the need for chaperones. Women's roles were largely confined to the domestic sphere, and their social interactions were carefully controlled. Unmarried women were expected to be modest, virtuous, and above all, chaste. Their public appearances were generally limited, and when they did venture out, it was typically for specific, sanctioned purposes like attending church, visiting relatives, or market days, always under watchful eyes. Absence of a chaperone would signal a dangerous lack of regard for social conventions and could be interpreted as an invitation for unwanted advances, or worse, a sign of moral laxity. A historical text from the early 13th century, a book of manners for young ladies, suggested that a virtuous maiden should never be alone in a room with a man, not even her own brother, if others are not present in the house. This illustrates the extreme caution expected. Even in situations where a chaperone might be physically present, their attentiveness was key. They were expected to listen to conversations, observe body language, and intervene if any interaction strayed from the realm of polite, formal exchange. The medieval dating scene, if one could even call it that, was thus less about individual connection and more about public performance and strict adherence to societal expectations, all overseen by an ever-present network of watchful eyes. Number 14. Parental consent is key. The notion of marrying for love, while it might appear in medieval poetry and romantic tales, was largely a foreign concept when it came to actual marital alliances in the medieval period. Instead, marriage was overwhelmingly a strategic affair, a fundamental tool for securing or enhancing a family's social standing, economic prosperity, and political influence. Consequently, the decision of who a child, especially a daughter, would marry rested almost entirely with the parents, particularly the father. A young person's personal preferences or burgeoning affections were often secondary, if considered at all, to the practical benefits the union could bring to the wider family unit. This absolute parental authority over marital choices was enshrined in custom, law, and religious doctrine, making parental consent not just important but absolutely essential for a legitimate and advantageous match. For noble families, marriages were grand alliances, often negotiated for years between powerful houses. A marriage contract might solidify a truce between warring lords, combine vast estates, or strengthen a political faction. A daughter, in this context, was a valuable commodity, a pawn in a larger game of power and prestige. Her hand in marriage could bring land, vassals, or a strategic advantageous position. The negotiations involved extensive discussions about dowries, property settlements, and future inheritances. Prospective bride and groom, if they were even old enough to understand the implications, had little to no say in these monumental decisions. For example, the marriage of Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful women of the Middle Ages, was initially arranged by her father, Duke William X, to Louis VII of France, a match designed to consolidate power and territory. Upon her father's death, she became a ward of the king, and her marriage was still largely dictated by dynastic concerns. While Eleanor eventually exerted her own influence, her initial marriage was a classic example of parental and political arrangement. Even among commoners, parental consent was paramount, although the stakes were different. For peasant families, a marriage might secure access to more land, ensure strong workforce for the farm, or unite two families with complementary skills or resources. A blacksmith's son might marry a miller's daughter, ensuring both families had necessary services. For artisans, marriage could bring in new skills, apprentices, or valuable connections within a guild. The economic survival and advancement of the family unit were the primary drivers. Children were expected to respect and obey their parents' decisions, viewing them as wise and experienced in matters of worldly affairs. Disobeying parental consent could lead to disinheritance, ostracization from the family, and a loss of community support, which in a tightly knit medieval village could be a devastating blow. The social safety net we recognize today did not exist. Family was your insurance. The Church, while emphasizing the importance of free consent for the validity of marriage, meaning a forced marriage was technically invalid under canon law, often struggled to enforce this against the deeply entrenched power of parental authority. In practice, while a young man or woman might be asked if they consented, the social pressure and the authority of their parents were so immense that refusing was almost unthinkable. To refuse would be to defy one's family, bring shame upon them, and jeopardize one's own future. Historians like Professor Alistair Jones of the University of Edinburgh, who has extensively studied medieval family structures, note that while instances of individuals seeking annulment on grounds of forced consent did occur, they were rare and extremely difficult to prove, especially if the marriage had been consummated. The burden of proof, was on the individual to show they were genuinely coerced, a challenging feat against powerful familial and societal expectations. The expectation was that children would willingly follow their parents' guidance, as their parents had their best interests, and more importantly, the family's best interests, at heart. The elaborate rituals around betrothal and marriage often included public affirmations of consent by the parents, symbolizing their approval and involvement, highlighting that the union was as much between two families as it was between two individuals. Number 13. Betrothal as binding as marriage. In the medieval period, the path to marriage was not a simple direct line from courtship to wedding ceremony as we might understand it today. Instead, there was a crucial, highly formalized and often legally binding step called betrothal, or sponsalia. This was far more than a modern engagement. In many respects, a medieval betrothal carried the same weight and legal implications as marriage itself, effectively committing two individuals to each other even before any religious ceremony took place. Breaking a betrothal was incredibly difficult, often requiring church intervention and carrying severe social and financial repercussions, making it a commitment not to be entered into lightly. The ceremony of betrothal varied, but it often involved public declarations of intent, exchanges of rings or other tokens, and the presence of witnesses. It could occur years before the actual wedding, especially if the betrothed were still children. There were two main types of betrothal recognized by canon law, which became increasingly influential in regulating marriage from the 12th century onwards. The first was sponsalia de persurit, a promise to marry in the future. While less binding if sexual relations occurred after this promise, it could be legally converted into a sponsalia de praesenti, essentially a marriage by consent. The second, and far more critical, was sponsalia de praesenti, a mutual declaration of consent to marry in the present tense, using words like, "I take thee as my wife," or "I take thee as my husband." Once these words were exchanged, even without a priest present, the couple was considered married in the eyes of the church. The subsequent church ceremony was largely a public affirmation and blessing of a union that had already, in essence, begun. The binding nature of betrothal had profound implications. If a couple were betrothed de praesenti, they were considered husband and wife. If either party subsequently tried to marry someone else, they would be committing bigamy, a serious offense under canon law, punishable by excommunication. For example, if a young woman was betrothed to one man and then, perhaps under new parental pressure, tried to marry another, the church would likely invalidate the second marriage and force her to return to her first betrothed. This legal framework was designed to prevent deception and ensure the sanctity of marital promises. A famous historical example involves King Henry VIII's desire to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. Part of the legal argument hinged on whether Catherine's previous marriage to Henry's elder brother Arthur had been fully valid and consummated. If it was, and if a betrothal was considered binding, it complicated Henry's subsequent marriage. Financial aspects also underscored the binding nature of betrothal. Dowries, the property a bride brought into the marriage, and dower, the property settled on a wife by her husband, were often negotiated and even partially exchanged at the time of betrothal. If a betrothal was broken, there would be complex legal battles over the return of these financial agreements. A family might invest significant resources in a betrothal, and its dissolution could lead to financial ruin or severe economic penalties. The social repercussions were equally severe. Breaking a betrothal, especially without legitimate cause, was considered a breach of faith and honor. The offending party, or their family, could face immense social ostracization, reputational damage, and a diminished ability to secure future alliances. A young woman who had been betrothed and then returned might be viewed with suspicion, impacting her future marital prospects. According to legal historian Professor David L. Peterson, of the University of Oxford medieval legal codes, both secular and ecclesiastical, dedicated considerable sections to disputes arising from broken betrothals, emphasizing the seriousness with which these promises were regarded. The betrothal was a public commitment, often celebrated with feasts and gatherings, further solidifying its status as a nearly unbreakable bond in the eyes of the community. Number 12. Dowry and dower are crucial. Forget the romantic ideal of a prince sweeping a princess off her feet. In the medieval world, a more accurate picture of a prospective marriage often involved a lengthy negotiation between two families, meticulously detailing financial agreements. At the heart of these discussions lay two critical concepts: the dowry and the dower. These were not mere gifts, but substantial transfers of wealth, property, or goods that were fundamental to sealing a marriage alliance. Without a satisfactory agreement on these financial matters, a marriage was unlikely to proceed, underscoring that medieval unions were as much about economic transactions as they were about personal relationships. The dowry was the property or wealth that the bride's family transferred to the groom or his family upon marriage, while the dower was the provision made by the groom for his wife, typically for her sustenance if she became a widow. The dowry, or dos in Latin, was perhaps the most significant financial component from the bride's side. It could consist of land, money, livestock, jewelry, or even household goods. The primary purpose of the dowry was to provide for the bride within her new husband's household and, crucially, to compensate the groom's family for taking on the financial burden of supporting her. In some cases, the dowry might revert to the wife if the husband died childless, or it might be passed on to her children. For noble families, dowries could be enormous, representing a significant portion of a family's movable wealth or even entire estates. For example, when Isabella of Castile married Ferdinand of Aragon in 1469, her dowry included a substantial sum of money and various Castilian strongholds, vital assets that underpinned the eventual unification of Spain. For commoners, a dowry might be more modest: a few livestock animals, a parcel of land, tools, or clothing. Even a peasant girl was expected to bring something, however small, to her new household, perhaps a loom or a spinning wheel. The size and nature of the dowry often reflected the social standing of the bride's family and their desire to secure a good match for their daughter. A family with a large dowry could attract a more prestigious husband, elevating their own social standing. The dower, on the other hand, was the husband's provision for his wife should she outlive him. It was typically a portion of his estate, often 1/3, set aside specifically for her use and income during her widowhood. This provision was crucial for a medieval woman as it provided her with financial security and independence should she lose her husband. Without a dower, a widow could be left destitute, dependent on the charity of her children or other relatives. The dower was usually agreed upon at the time of the marriage contract and was legally protected, meaning the husband's heirs could not disinherit his widow from her dower lands or income. For instance, a medieval woman might receive a specific manor or a certain amount of annual income from her deceased husband's lands as her dower. This was not a gift, but a right. Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine, upon the death of her husband, King Louis VII of France, retained her significant dower lands, which provided her with independent income and power even after her remarriage to Henry II of England. The dower system ensured that women were not entirely powerless after their husband's death, offering a measure of economic stability in an otherwise precarious existence. The intricate negotiations surrounding dowry and dower highlight the pragmatic nature of medieval marriage. These were not simply gifts, but carefully calculated investments and security arrangements. Disputes over dowry payments or dower rights were common and often led to protracted legal battles in both secular and ecclesiastical courts. A marriage might be delayed or even called off if the dowry was not delivered as promised, or if the dower agreement was deemed insufficient. As Professor Martha E. Jones, a historian of medieval law at the University of Pennsylvania, explains in her extensive research, these financial arrangements were the bedrock upon which familial alliances were built, far outweighing any considerations of romantic love or personal compatibility. They were essential mechanisms for the transfer of wealth, the consolidation of power, and the provision of economic security within a highly stratified society where personal fortunes were inextricably linked to family connections. Number 11. Love marriages were rare. Popular image of medieval romance, often fueled by tales of chivalry and courtly love, can be misleading when it comes to the reality of medieval marriage. While passionate love certainly existed between individuals, marrying for love, as the sole or even primary reason for union, was exceedingly rare across all social strata. Instead, marriage was overwhelmingly viewed as a practical institution, a fundamental tool for economic advancement, social stability, and the consolidation of power and lineage. Personal affection, if it developed at all, was typically seen as a fortunate byproduct of a well-arranged match rather than its initial driving force. For the aristocracy and nobility, marriage was a sophisticated political maneuver. A bride or groom represented an opportunity to expand territory, forge military alliances, or consolidate wealth. Dynasties were built and preserved through strategic marriages, ensuring the continuation of noble lines and the accumulation of vast estates. Choice of a spouse was a matter for families, not individuals, and decisions were based on pragmatic considerations such as land ownership, political influence, and strategic location. For example, the marriage of Edward I of England to Eleanor of Castile in 1254 was not a love match. It was a carefully orchestrated diplomatic coup that brought territories in Gascony and significant political stability. Their personal affection, which later biographies suggest was genuine, grew within the marriage rather than preceding it. Daughters were particularly valuable in this system, often acting as human bridges between powerful families, their personal desires almost entirely secondary to the needs of their lineage. Among the merchant and urban classes, marriage served similar economic purposes. A marriage might unite two prosperous trading families, expand a business network, or provide access to new markets. A merchant's daughter might be wed to an apprentice in her father's trade, ensuring the continuity of the business and keeping skills within the family. For example, in the thriving textile towns of Flanders or Italy, a marriage between the daughter of a master weaver and the son of a wool merchant could create a formidable economic enterprise. Property, connections, and skills were paramount. A good match meant one that improved the family's financial standing, not necessarily one that sparked romantic feelings. These pragmatic considerations were openly discussed, and the suitability of a match was judged on its material benefits rather than emotional compatibility. Even for the vast majority of the population, the peasantry, marriage was rooted in practicalities. A new wife or husband represented an extra pair of hands for labor on the farm, bringing in a small dowry of livestock or tools, and continuing the family line to ensure labor for the future. Marriages were often arranged within the same village or among neighboring communities to maintain social cohesion and support networks. The physical demands of medieval life meant that a strong, healthy spouse was often more valued than a romantic partner. The concept of love in these contexts was often more akin to mutual respect, shared labor, and companionship that developed over years of shared hardships and responsibilities, rather than the intense, passionate emotion celebrated in troubadour songs. As Professor Susan M. Reynolds, a historian specializing in medieval society, frequently points out in her work on medieval family life, the modern emphasis on individual choice and romantic love as the basis for marriage would have been bewildering. Marriage was a communal affair, a contract between families vital for survival and prosperity in a challenging world. Any personal affection was a bonus, not a prerequisite, and was expected to grow from the shared life and duties rather than preceding the solemn vows. Number 10. Church's role in marriage. While families and secular lords certainly held immense sway over medieval marriages, the Church's influence, particularly from the 12th century onwards, grew to be incredibly profound, transforming marriage from a purely contractual arrangement into a sacred sacrament. Canon law. The body of ecclesiastical law governing the Church began to dictate who could marry, how they could marry, and what constituted a valid union. This increasing ecclesiastical control meant that the Church became the ultimate arbiter of marital legitimacy, introducing complex rules about consent, impediments, and the very nature of the bond, fundamentally reshaping the experience of marrying in the medieval period. Prior to the 12th century, marriage customs were quite varied across Europe, often blending Roman legal traditions with local Germanic practices. Marriages could be formalized through simple exchanges of vows, cohabitation, or parental agreements. However, as the Church sought to centralize its authority and regulate Christian life, it increasingly asserted its jurisdiction over marriage, culminating in the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215. This pivotal council established that marriage was a sacrament, a holy bond reflecting the union of Christ and the Church. This designation elevated marriage to a spiritual status, making it indissoluble, meaning it could not be broken by divorce, and subject primarily to church law. One of the most significant aspects of the Church's involvement was its emphasis on mutual consent. While parental approval was socially crucial, canon law decreed that for a marriage to be valid, both the bride and groom had to freely consent. A marriage performed under duress, even if parents agreed. However, as discussed earlier, the practical application of this rule was often challenged by overwhelming social pressures. The Church also introduced strict rules regarding impediments to marriage. These were conditions that would prevent a valid marriage from taking place. The most common impediments included consanguinity and affinity. This referred to relationships by blood, consanguinity, and by marriage, affinity. The Church's rules on marrying relatives were incredibly extensive, sometimes prohibiting marriage up to the seventh degree of kinship, meaning you could not marry anyone with whom you shared a common ancestor within 7 generations. This was a significant hurdle in small, isolated communities, where everyone was related to some degree. Many noble families, often seeking to maintain wealth and power within their lineage, would find themselves running afoul of these rules, requiring papal dispensations to marry closely related cousins. Pre-existing vows or betrothal. If one party had already taken religious vows, e.g., becoming a monk or nun, or was already validly betrothed or married to another person, they could not enter into a new marriage. Lack of age. The Church set minimum ages for marriage, typically 12 for girls and 14 for boys, although informal betrothals could occur earlier. Impotence. As marriage was intended for procreation, a permanent inability to consummate the marriage could be grounds for annulment. The Church also standardized the marriage ceremony, emphasizing the public exchange of vows, often outside the church door, followed by a blessing by a priest inside the church. Bans of marriage. Public announcements made in the Church on 3 separate occasions prior to the wedding were introduced to give anyone who knew of an impediment the opportunity to come forward. This system aimed to prevent clandestine marriages and ensure transparency. When disputes arose over the validity of a marriage, such as claims of bigamy or lack of consent, these cases were heard in ecclesiastical courts, which often had jurisdiction over a wide range of personal matters. According to the influential work of legal historian Professor Charles Donahue, Jr. of Harvard Law School, the Church's gradual but firm assertion of authority over marriage significantly shaped not only legal frameworks, but also societal perceptions of family, legitimacy, and morality for centuries to come. Number 9. Consummation makes it official. In the medieval understanding of marriage, the exchange of vows, while profoundly important and recognized by the Church, was often considered a preliminary step rather than the ultimate seal of the union. The final, and arguably most crucial, act that truly legitimized and completed a marriage was its consummation. This meant the performance of sexual intercourse by the married couple. Without consummation, a marriage, even one solemnized with all the proper rituals and witnesses, could be challenged and potentially annulled. This concept highlights a pragmatic and biological dimension to medieval marriage, linking its validity to the potential for procreation and the fulfillment of marital duties. The emphasis on consummation stemmed from several factors. From a theological perspective, marriage was seen as a sacrament intended for the procreation of children and as a remedy for concupiscence, sexual desire. If a marriage could not achieve these ends, its purpose was seen as unfulfilled. Canon law increasingly reflected this view. While a valid marriage could be formed by mutual consent, per verba de presenti, by words of the present, the Church held that this union was not truly indissoluble until it had been consummated. The act of sexual intercourse was believed to create a new singular bond between the couple, making their two bodies one, mirroring biblical interpretations. For instance, if a couple exchanged vows and then before consummation one of them decided to enter a monastery or convent, the Church would often allow the marriage to be dissolved because the sacred bond had not yet been fully forged by the physical act. Practical implications of this rule were significant, particularly in cases of annulment. Annulment, not divorce, was the only way to dissolve a valid marriage in the eyes of the Church. One of the primary grounds for seeking an annulment was the non-consummation of the marriage. If a couple could prove that they had not, for whatever reason, engaged in sexual intercourse after their wedding, their marriage could be declared null and void, as if it had never legitimately existed. This was distinct from divorce, which broke an existing marriage. An annulment declared that a valid marriage had never taken place. Proving non-consummation, however, could be a difficult and often humiliating process. It sometimes involved physical examinations or the testimony of witnesses, which could be intrusive and scandalous. A famous historical example involving this principle is the marriage of Catherine of Aragon to Arthur, Prince of Wales, and subsequently to his younger brother, Henry VIII. When Henry sought to annul his marriage to Catherine, his primary argument was that her first marriage to Arthur had been consummated. If it had been, then her subsequent marriage to Henry was supposedly invalid according to biblical prohibitions against marrying a brother's wife. Catherine steadfastly maintained that her marriage to Arthur had not been consummated, thereby allowing her marriage to Henry to be considered valid under church law. The entire future of the English monarchy, and indeed the English Reformation, hinged on this very point of consummation. Another instance might involve an arranged child marriage where the couple was betrothed or even formally wed at a young age, but the marriage was not consummated until they reached maturity. If one party died before maturity, the marriage could be argued as unconsummated, and thus open to various legal interpretations regarding inheritance and property rights. As Professor R.H. Helmholtz, a leading scholar of medieval canon law, details in his extensive studies, the concept of consummation was central to the legal and theological understanding of marriage, giving it a tangible physical component that complemented the spiritual and contractual aspects of the union. It underscored that marriage was not just a legal agreement or a spiritual vow, but a complete joining of lives, including the physical dimension. Number 8. Age of consent was shockingly low. When we consider the medieval period, the concept of childhood as a distinct and protected phase of life, as we understand it today, was largely absent. Children were often viewed as miniature adults, expected to contribute to the household or family economy from a young age. This pragmatic approach extended to marriage, where the legal age of consent was remarkably low by modern standards. For girls, the minimum age was typically set at 12 years old, and for boys, it was 14 years old. While formal marriage ceremonies might be delayed until slightly older ages, betrothals and even legally binding marriages could occur once a child reached these tender ages, reflecting a stark contrast to contemporary norms and highlighting the economic. These ages were established primarily by canon law, the law of the Church, which governed marriage across Western Europe. The rationale for these ages was often linked to physical maturity and the potential for procreation. 12, a girl was generally considered to have reached puberty and thus capable of bearing children, fulfilling one of the key purposes of marriage. Similarly, 14 for a boy was deemed the age of male sexual maturity. However, it was not just about physical capability. It was also about the legal capacity to give consent. The Church decreed that children at these ages were theoretically capable of understanding the nature of the marital contract and giving their free consent. While these were the minimum legal ages, actual marriages often happened slightly later, especially among commoners when the individuals were more capable of contributing labor to a household or managing a farm. For example, a peasant girl might marry at 16 or 17 and a boy at 18 or 20 after they had accumulated some small resources or gained practical skills. However, among the nobility and royalty, marriages at or very near the minimum age were not uncommon, especially when dynastic alliances were at stake. Princesses might be betrothed in their cradles and married off at 12 or 13 to solidify a treaty or merge powerful families. For instance, Margaret of Anjou was married to King Henry VI of England when she was 15 years old. Closer to the minimum, Isabella of Valois was married to King Richard II of England when she was only 7 years old, though the marriage was famously not consummated until she was much older. Such early marriages were often arranged by parents to secure advantageous alliances that simply could not wait for the children to reach full adulthood. The concept of malice supplanted age also played a role. This legal principle suggested that if a child, even below the standard age of consent, clearly understood the nature and implications of the marital contract and willingly entered into it, their lack of age could be overridden. This was a complex legal point and often depended on the specific circumstances and the judgment of ecclesiastical courts. However, in practice, the power of parental authority often overshadowed individual child agency. While the Church stated that consent must be free, the immense pressure from families, coupled with the children's limited understanding of alternatives, often meant that consent was given out of obedience and necessity, rather than true personal choice. As Professor Eleanor Searle, a prominent historian of medieval social history, emphasizes, the low age of consent reflects a different societal understanding of childhood and responsibility, where children were integrated into the adult world much earlier and often had their futures, including their marital fate, determined by their families for the greater good of the lineage. These early unions, especially for girls, often meant a swift transition from childhood dependence to the demanding responsibilities of wife and future mother. Number 7. No divorce, mostly. The medieval Church held an incredibly firm stance on the sanctity and indissolubility of marriage. Once a marriage was validly contracted and crucially consummated, it was considered a lifelong, unbreakable bond in the eyes of God and the Church. This meant that what we understand as divorce today, the legal dissolution of a marriage allowing both parties to remarry, simply did not exist in the medieval Christian world. For unhappy or mismatched couples, there was no straightforward path to end their marital vows. The only true avenue for dissolving a marital union was through annulment, a complex legal process that declared a marriage had never been valid in the first place, rather than breaking an existing one. The Church's teaching on the indissolubility of marriage was rooted in biblical interpretation and solidified by canon law. Marriage was viewed as a sacrament, reflecting the unbreakable union between Christ and the Church. To permit divorce would be to undermine this sacred symbolism and contradict divine law. Therefore, once the vows were exchanged and the marriage consummated, the couple was bound until death. This presented significant challenges for individuals in genuinely unhappy, abusive, or unproductive marriages. They could not simply walk away and start fresh with someone else. However, while divorce was impossible, annulment offered a narrow, often difficult, legal loophole. An annulment was a declaration by an ecclesiastical court that a marriage was void ab initio, meaning it was invalid from its very beginning. It was as if the marriage had never legitimately existed. Grounds for annulment were specific and strict, including pre-contract. One party was already validly betrothed or married to another person. Consanguinity or affinity. The parties were too closely related by blood or marriage according to canon law. This was a frequent ground, especially for nobility, who often sought to marry within a limited pool of families. Lack of proper consent. One party was forced into the marriage, was insane, or was too young to understand the contract at the time of the vows. Proving lack of consent could be difficult if the marriage had been ongoing for years. Impotence or non-consummation. A permanent inability to perform sexual intercourse, or the failure to consummate the marriage, could be grounds for annulment, as marriage was for procreation. Error of identity. One party married the wrong person, believing them to be someone else. The process of obtaining an annulment was lengthy, expensive, and often required powerful connections, especially for complex cases. It involved presenting evidence to church courts, calling witnesses, and often required appeals through various ecclesiastical hierarchies, potentially all the way to the Pope. The most famous example is Henry VIII's relentless pursuit of an annulment from Catherine of Aragon. His desire for a male heir and his affection for Anne Boleyn led him to argue that his marriage to Catherine was invalid due to her prior, allegedly consummated marriage to his deceased brother. This monumental legal battle ultimately contributed to the English Reformation. While annulment was the only way to end a marriage in the eyes of the Church with the possibility of remarriage, there was another option: separation a mensa et thoro, from bed and board. This was a legal separation that allowed a couple to live apart and divided their property, but neither party was permitted to remarry. They remained legally married. This was granted in cases of serious offenses like adultery, cruelty, or heresy. It offered physical separation and relief from an intolerable situation, but left individuals in a legal limbo, unable to form new, legitimate unions. As historian James A. Brundage, a specialist in medieval canon law, extensively documents, the medieval church's rigid stance on marriage meant that marital breakdown, while emotionally devastating, rarely led to the ability to legally start anew with a different partner, underscoring the formidable and unyielding nature of the marital bond in this era. Number 6. Widows had more freedom. In a society where women's lives were largely dictated by the men in their families, fathers, then husbands, widows often found themselves in a unique and surprisingly advantageous position. While their grief was undoubtedly profound, medieval law and custom, particularly concerning property, afforded widows a degree of independence and agency rarely seen in unmarried or married women. This newfound freedom stemmed from their established rights to property, their proven ability to manage households, and their potential to control their own destiny, particularly in choosing whether or not to remarry. A key factor in a widow's relative autonomy was the concept of the dower. As discussed earlier, the dower was the portion of her deceased husband's estate, often 1/3, that was set aside for her lifetime support. This meant that upon her husband's death, a widow typically inherited or had rights to specific lands, income, or property. This dower was legally protected and was not subject to the claims of her husband's heirs, nor could it be taken away by her own family. This direct control over resources gave her an economic base that many women never experienced. For example, a widow might suddenly find herself managing a large manor, overseeing agricultural production, collecting rents, and directing servants. This experience in administration and financial management further bolstered her independent standing. Lady Margaret Beaufort, mother of King Henry VII, famously used her dower lands to become a powerful and influential figure, acting as a patron of learning and a shrewd businesswoman. Beyond financial independence, widows often had more control over their own bodies and future marriages. While a father had absolute authority over his unmarried daughter's marriage, and a husband over his wife's property and legal status, a widow, especially if she had adult children, often had the right to choose whether or not to remarry. Her decision was still influenced by family pressure and social expectations, but it was generally recognized that she had more agency in this matter. A second marriage could be beneficial, providing protection, companionship, or consolidating family wealth. However, a widow might also choose to remain single, particularly if she was wealthy and capable, preferring to manage her own affairs and retain control over her dower lands, which she would lose if she remarried, as they would then fall under the control of her new husband. The Church also played a role in recognizing a widow's unique status. While it encouraged remarriage for younger widows for the sake of procreation, it also lauded the virtue of remaining chaste and dedicating oneself to a spiritual life. This provided a socially acceptable alternative for widows who did not wish to remarry. Many older widows, having fulfilled their marital duties, might choose to live a devout life, engage in charity, or even retire to a convent, retaining their independence and spiritual merit. The medieval law also protected a widow's right to custody of her minor children and their property, making her their legal guardian and further enhancing her authority within the family. For instance, the Magna Carta, a foundational English legal document, included clauses specifically protecting the rights of widows to their inheritance and to not be forced into remarriage against their will. As historian Joanne McNamara, a leading scholar of women in the Middle Ages, highlights, the medieval widow's position, while not entirely free from societal constraints, offered a significant degree of freedom and power compared to other female statuses, transforming her into a figure of considerable potential influence and self-determination within the rigid patriarchal structure in her rituals. Number 5. Courtly love vs. real love. The medieval period is often associated with the romantic ideal of courtly love, a literary tradition that painted vivid pictures of knights pledging their undying devotion to unattainable noble ladies, often married women. These narratives, found in epic poems, romances, and troubadour songs, celebrate passionate, idealized, and often secret love, typically characterized by chivalrous deeds, profound respect, and emotional intensity. However, it is crucial to understand that courtly love was a literary construct, an elaborate game of poetic and social conventions, and stood in stark contrast to the gritty, pragmatic realities of marriage in the medieval world. While it influenced ideals of romance, it rarely, if ever, translated directly into the foundation of actual marital unions. Courtly love, emerging in the 11th and 12th centuries, particularly in southern France, was essentially an aristocratic pastime. It revolved around a specific set of rules and behaviors. The lover, often a knight, would serve his lady, often a queen or a noblewoman of higher status and typically married, with absolute devotion, performing heroic deeds in her name, composing poetry for her, and enduring suffering for her sake. The love was typically unconsummated, physically, emphasizing spiritual and emotional adoration. This unconsummated nature was a key feature. It distinguished courtly love from crude lust and heightened its purity. The suffering of the lover, often involving intense longing and secrecy, was part of the romantic appeal. Examples abound in the stories of Lancelot and Guinevere, Tristan and Isolde, or the songs of the troubadours, like Bernard de Ventadorn. These narratives popularized the idea of love as an ennobling, almost spiritual force that could inspire greatness. However, the real world of medieval marriage was built on entirely different foundations. As previously discussed, marriages were primarily strategic alliances for economic, political, and social advancement. Love was not a prerequisite. A noble family would never risk its lineage, land, or power for the sake of a passionate but illicit affair. A knight who genuinely pursued a married lady in the manner of courtly love would likely face severe repercussions, including social disgrace, loss of patronage, and even physical punishment from the lady's husband or family. The secrecy inherent in courtly love reflected the dangerous reality that such relationships, if discovered, could unravel carefully constructed social orders and trigger violent retribution. The literature itself often depicted the tragic consequences of blurring the lines between idealized love and real-world marital infidelity. So what was the purpose of courtly love if it wasn't about real marriage? Historians and literary scholars suggest several functions. It provided a sophisticated form of entertainment and intellectual pursuit for the aristocracy, particularly noble women. It offered a safe, idealized outlet for romantic and emotional expression in a society where actual marriage was often devoid of such sentiments. It also helped to refine manners and inspire chivalry, encouraging knights to act honorably and bravely. Some scholars, like Professor C.S. Lewis in his seminal work, The Allegory of Love, argue that courtly love played a role in inventing romantic love as we understand it, providing a blueprint for intense individualistic affection. Yet it remained firmly within the realm of literature and elaborate social games, a world apart from the pragmatic and often austere reality of medieval marital life. A couple would marry for property and lineage, and if affection grew over time, it was a welcome bonus. But the passionate, unattainable love of the troubadours was a fantasy, providing an escape from the duties and expectations of their arranged unions. Number 4. Public bits of affection were taboo. In the medieval period, the concept of modesty, decorum, and the careful preservation of reputation permeated every aspect of social interaction, especially concerning interactions between men and women. Public displays of affection, even seemingly innocuous gestures like hand-holding or casual embraces, were largely considered taboo. Such actions were not just frowned upon. They could be interpreted as scandalous, signaling a lack of proper upbringing, a disregard for social norms, and potentially hinting at illicit behavior. This strict adherence to formality and restraint reflected the overarching importance of honor, chastity, and the carefully constructed social order that governed medieval society. For unmarried individuals, particularly young women, any physical contact with a member of the opposite sex outside of immediate family was viewed with extreme suspicion. Public touch, a shared, whispered joke, or even prolonged eye contact could be enough to tarnish a young woman's reputation, making her seem immodest or forward. This was particularly dangerous because a woman's virginity and perceived chastity would directly linked to her family's honor and her prospects for a good marriage. A suitor seeking a wife would desire a woman with an unimpeachable reputation, and any public display of affection would raise red flags, suggesting she was not as virtuous as expected. For example, a legal record from 15th century England, documented by historian Philippa C. Davis, recounts a case where a marriage proposal was withdrawn after a young woman was seen laughing too freely and touching the arm of a young man during a public feast. The mere perception of impropriety was enough to cause significant damage. Even for married couples, Public displays of affection were generally avoided. While affection undoubtedly existed within marriages, it was considered a private matter to be expressed within the confines of the home, away from public scrutiny. Public spaces were for business worship and formal social intimate bonds, not for demonstrating intimate bonds. Married couples were expected to maintain a dignified and reserved demeanor in public, reflecting their commitment to their social roles and their family's standing. Excessive familiarity in public could be seen as undignified or even a sign of a lack of proper self-control. The rigid social hierarchy also played a role. Gestures of affection might blur lines of status or respect. Pervasive influence of the church also reinforced this emphasis on modesty. Christian teachings often stressed humility, temperance, and the control of carnal desires. Public displays of physical affection could be seen as an indulgence in worldly pleasures, potentially leading to sin, or at least a lack of Christian decorum. Religious art and literature often depicted virtuous women as reserved and demure, reinforcing the societal ideal. Clothes were designed to be modest and concealing, further discouraging any public display of the body or intimate gestures. The expectation was that interactions, especially between men and women, should be formal, respectful, and conducted with a keen awareness of one's social standing and the watchful eyes of the community. In this environment, a simple touch or a knowing glance could carry significant weight and potentially disastrous consequences for one's reputation, underscoring the deep emphasis on outward propriety over any form of spontaneous personal expression. Number 3. Family honor above all else. In the medieval social landscape, the individual was rarely an autonomous entity. Instead, identity, status, and survival were inextricably linked to the family. This collective identity meant that the honor and reputation of the family unit superseded individual desires, actions, or even happiness. Nowhere was this more evident than in matters of courtship and marriage. An individual's conduct, particularly regarding chastity for women and integrity for men, directly reflected upon the entire family's standing in the community. Any perceived stain on one member's honor could bring shame and social disgrace upon the entire lineage, underscoring that family honor was paramount, a precious commodity to be fiercely protected and maintained. For women, the concept of honor was overwhelmingly tied to their chastity and sexual purity. A daughter's virginity before marriage was an essential asset, guaranteeing the legitimacy of her future children and the purity of the family bloodline. Any rumor of impropriety, any perceived loss of virginity outside of marriage could irrevocably tarnish not only the woman's reputation but also that of her parents, siblings, and future generations. Such a stain could severely diminish her marriage prospects, making it impossible for her to secure a match with a reputable family. This was not merely a social inconvenience. In a society where marriage was an economic and political contract, a damaged reputation could lead to financial ruin and a catastrophic loss of status for the entire family. For instance, if a noble daughter was discovered to be unchaste, her powerful family might refuse to acknowledge her, and her family might be forced to accept a much lower status marriage, or she might be confined to a convent, all to mitigate the damage to their collective honor. For men, honor was linked to their ability to protect their female kin, their martial prowess, their word, and their adherence to social codes. A man who allowed his sister or daughter to be dishonored, or who failed to uphold his promises, would bring shame upon himself and his family. The concept of blood feud or violent retribution for perceived slights to family honor was not uncommon, particularly in earlier medieval periods or in regions with weaker centralized authority. Duels, feuds, and legal battles could erupt over insults or perceived breaches of honor, demonstrating the tangible consequences of its violation. The arrangements of marriage themselves were intensely focused on maintaining and enhancing family honor. Parents meticulously vetted potential spouses, not just for wealth or power, but also for their family's reputation and moral standing. A marriage between two honorable families was seen as a virtuous act, bolstering the respect commanded by both lineages. Conversely, marrying into a family with a tarnished reputation could be devastating. This meant that individual desires or romantic attachments were often suppressed in favor of decisions that would secure the family's collective honor and future. The individual was a vessel for the family's legacy. As historian Paul Friedman notes in his work on medieval society, the medieval preoccupation with honor shaped everything from legal codes to daily social interactions, fostering a climate where individual beef. The weight of generations of reputation rested on each individual's shoulders, especially when it came to forging new alliances. Number 2. Social class dictated everything. In the rigidly hierarchical world of the Middle Ages, one's social class was not just a descriptor. It was a fundamental determinant of virtually every aspect of life, from the clothes one wore and the food one ate, to the opportunities available, and most significantly, who one could marry. The medieval social structure was characterized by distinct, often hereditary strata: the nobility, the clergy, and the peasantry, with the rise of a merchant class adding another layer in later centuries. Marriage across these social divides, known as misalliance, was incredibly rare, highly frowned upon, and often legally or socially forbidden. Social class dictated everything about medieval courtship and marriage, serving as an invisible yet impenetrable barrier between different segments of society. For the nobility, marriage was almost exclusively confined to their own class, or to royalty. A noble would marry another noble, and a king would marry a princess. This was not merely a preference, it was a necessity for maintaining and consolidating power, land, and lineage. Marrying outside of the noble class would dilute bloodlines, jeopardize inheritances, and undermine the very concept of inherited privilege. A noble daughter, for example, would never be permitted to marry a commoner, regardless of any personal attraction or wealth he might possess, as it would bring disgrace to her family and invalidate their claims to superior status. Powerful, noble families meticulously documented their genealogies to ensure proper lineage and to identify suitable matches within their own or allied aristocratic circles across Europe. The Habsburgs, a prominent European dynasty, famously built an empire through strategic marriages within royal and noble families, demonstrating how class and dynastic alliances were intertwined. Clergy, by the High Middle Ages, were largely celibate, meaning they were outside the conventional marriage system. This further solidified their distinct social position. For the vast majority of the population, the peasantry, marriage was also largely endogamous, meaning confined to their own social group. Peasant would marry another peasant, typically from the same village or a nearby one. This was due to practicalities. Peasants lived and worked on the land, their lives dictated by the agricultural cycle. Marriage was about forming a new labor unit and continuing the lineage to work the land. While a wealthy peasant might have slightly more options, they would still marry within the broader peasant class. They had no access to the noble class, nor did the nobility consider them as viable marital partners. The concept of marrying up was virtually non-existent for commoners wishing to enter the aristocracy through marriage. Such a union would be seen as an outrageous affront to the established order. Even within the emerging merchant class, social stratification was evident. Wealthy merchants might arrange marriages with other wealthy merchant families to combine fortunes and expand their trading networks. However, they generally did not marry into the nobility, nor did the nobility marry into their ranks, as the values and sources of their wealth, land vs. trade, were fundamentally different and often viewed with disdain by the landed gentry. Instances of misalliance were rare and severely punished by social ostracization, or in some cases legal consequences. A noble who married a commoner might lose their inheritance or social standing, effectively being disinherited from their class. As Professor George Dubé, a leading historian of medieval society, repeatedly emphasized in his seminal works, the medieval social hierarchy was almost impervious, and marriage was one of the most powerful mechanisms for its reinforcement, ensuring that each generation largely remained within the societal bounds of their birth. This rigid class structure permeated every decision related to pairing, making any true form of social mobility through marriage nearly impossible. Number 1. Premarital relations were a huge deal. In the medieval period, deeply rooted in Christian morality and a profound emphasis on honor and lineage, premarital sexual relations were considered a grave transgression with severe consequences. This was not a minor societal disapproval. It was a huge deal, capable of destroying a person's reputation, jeopardizing their marriage prospects, and bringing immense shame upon their entire family. For women, in particular, the expectation of virginity before marriage was paramount, and its loss outside of wedlock could lead to social ruin, underscoring the era's strict moral codes and the vital importance placed on female chastity. The Church, as the primary moral authority, unequivocally condemned fornication, sex outside of marriage, as a mortal sin. Religious texts and sermons preached the importance of chastity and purity, especially for young unmarried individuals. Confession was mandatory, and penance would be assigned for such sins, reflecting their spiritual gravity. However, beyond the spiritual ramifications, the social and practical consequences were equally devastating. For a young woman, her virginity was considered her most valuable asset, directly linked to her honor, and crucially her marketability in the marriage market. A potential husband and his family would expect a bride to be a virgin, guaranteeing the legitimacy of future heirs and the purity of the family line. If a woman was discovered to have engaged in premarital relations, her reputation would be irrevocably tarnished. She would be viewed as dishonored, unchaste, or fallen. Such a reputation would make it exceedingly difficult, if not impossible, for her to secure a respectable marriage. Families would be wary of associating with someone whose reputation might bring shame upon their own lineage. In some cases, a dishonored woman might be forced to marry the man responsible, often a man of lower status, or might be confined to a convent or even ostracized by her family and community. The social stigma was immense and lasting. Legal codes, even secular ones, sometimes provided harsh penalties for fornication, especially if it resulted in illegitimate children. For example, some manorial court records, as studied by Professor Barbara A. Hannawalt, reveal instances of fines or public shaming for individuals found guilty of such acts. For men, while the social consequences might not be as devastating as for women, premarital relations were still condemned. A man who engaged in such acts might be seen as lacking self-control, potentially untrustworthy, or as a seducer. If he got a woman pregnant, he would typically be obligated to support the child, and the stigma of illegitimacy would fall upon the child and potentially hinder their future prospects. However, the double standard was evident. A man's overall reputation was less tied to his virginity than a woman's. While he might face moral censure or financial penalties, his ability to marry a respectable woman was generally less impacted than hers. The intensity of this rule stemmed from the collective nature of medieval society and the absolute reliance on family honor. An unmarried woman's chastity was not just her own. It was a reflection of her parents' ability to control their household and their family's overall moral standing. Any perceived lapse brought collective shame. The elaborate rituals of betrothal and marriage, the presence of chaperones, and the public nature of many interactions were all designed to prevent opportunities for premarital relations and to ensure the preservation of chastity. The fear of dishonor and social ruin acted as a powerful deterrent, making premarital relations a risk that few were willing or able to take without severe consequences.